Thank you, Ada. Can we? I know she gave you a lot to think about, but we do have to go on with our program. Thank you, Ada, for a very stimulating paper. And I just have one personal comment. I teach a course in general Jewish history to a Society Humanistic Judaism group. And from the secondary sources I have culled, I have been teaching that Hasidism in its early years was open to the participation of women, including Baal Shem Tov's daughter, and so on, and that its great appeal. Yes, exactly, and that that for the poor it was a great way to validate their religious experience and so on. And now you're telling me, strike it, all wrong. So I appreciate it, and now we'll go on. Steve has a comment.
I have actually a procedural comment. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that on substantive grounds we're going to have much to disagree with about this masterful lecture. Inasmuch as this is an organization that is committed to breaking the mold, can I suggest a procedural change in this session, and that is just to open it up. I mean, I've loved my conversations with those of you in the hall, and I was actually surprised when I learned that the 4 o'clock session, which I had assumed would allow all of us to talk with one another, was designed along somewhat different lines. And my guess is that some at least, of what Dr. Rapoport-Albert said surprised you. What if you talk with her, and she talks with you? And I've enjoyed talking with Ada now for the last 15 years since I met her, and I just would like to share this this pleasant experience with the rest of you.
Yes. Stephen, I'd like to propose an alternative, which is to allow the people up here to respond first, and then if there are no further responses, then to invite the audience to participate.
Okay. Yeah, Derek.
I'm going to ask a question that may very well have occurred to people here, so it'll be less a scholarly question than perhaps a more presentist question, which is the Hasidic movement has from the start then had a very strong messianic redemptive quality, which it's somehow kept under wraps. It's kept it from going to the brink, from going to the point of a second Sabbatian hysteria. Even the Chabad movement, and I was in Israel not long ago when the Rebbe died, or apparently died. And I was witness to films of hundreds of his supporters in Bnei Brak dancing in the streets, believing that redemption was near, and there were the bumper stickers and the billboards all over Jerusalem, all over the country, that the age of the Messiah had come.
New York Times Magazine, too.
That's right. Moshiach, be a part of it. Yeah. Now, even within the Chabad movement, it seems to have contained itself and pulled back from the brink. And I'm just wondering, based on your knowledge of the history of the movement as a whole, how we can understand how this movement maintains both this very high level of messianic tension and yet keeps itself from going over the edge.
I think that Messianism has a tremendous history of survival within Judaism. And that the fact that hopes of immediate redemption are frustrated has never led to a mass abandonment of Judaism. There's a tremendous bouncing back power. And there are lots of devices that help organize one's view of oneself, of the world, of what has happened, in a way that would guarantee that one can proceed, that one needn't say, that's the end. If that is so, I'm leaving. And one of them that was available and is available to Hasidism now is, of course, the wonderful mechanism of Gilgul, of transmigration, which has been within the tradition for centuries, I mean, is alive within the Kabbalistic tradition. And it may surprise you, or you may be aware of it, that even the Baal Shem Tov was expected to return within 60 years because the task of redemption had not been accomplished before his death. That after Rabbi Nachman of Braslav died, his disciples went around expecting him to return first within 40 years, then within 60 years, speculations about, and it was nothing shocking or sensational simply because it was believed to take place through Gilgul. The soul of the Messiah is the same soul that is embodied time and again in other candidates for the completion of the task. And if one of them does not, and there are ancient rabbinic models for it. Bar Kochva was not the Messiah. Rabbi Akiva thought he was. There wasn't a crisis of faith in rabbinic Judaism as a result of this disappointment. So the ability of the system to readjust itself. I mean, in fact, what happens in Sabbateanism itself is the most remarkable example of how it works. Even when the Sabbatai Tzvi, the Messiah, becomes a Muslim, even when eventually he dies, you still have large numbers of people who are prepared to believe that he is the Messiah, but return to being observant, pious Jews, in fact committed to a very intense penitential devotional life, waiting for him to come back and complete the task. So I think that the idea of imminent redemption, which flares up from time to time and then dies down, is something that exists within Hasidic tradition as it existed within earlier. What is new in Hasidism is that it is a mass movement, so it looks very different when it happens, like Sabbateanism was a mass movement. Suddenly it is there and you're aware of it, whereas when it was happening before, it was very local, very contained, that very few people would respond to it. But I don't see the two perceptions of, is Hasidism acutely messianic, or is it a neutralization of messianism, as Sholem has argued? They're not mutually exclusive of one another. They coexist within the system all along, and there are circumstances and areas where one becomes the dominant and others in which the other becomes dominant, and the ability to swap is there very readily. The most remarkable case, perhaps in recent history, of another great, active, acute messianic upsurge within Chabad is, of course, the messianic expectations surrounding the previous Rebbe, the father-in-law of Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who is the one who died, who in the pre-war years, and increasingly during the early 40s, during the war, was advocating that messianic redemption is imminent. He predicted, he unfortunately embedded this notion in a completely erroneous reading of the political situation and of the outcome of the Second World War. He predicted that Hitler would win and that the whole of Europe would be conquered by the Nazis, and there would be the wars of Gog and Magog. There would be tremendous destruction and extermination and annihilation, from which, out of the fire, would come the Messiah redemption. He never said it was him, but it was similarly believed by all his associates that it was him. And this was extinguished almost overnight, once the war was over. And the journal that was published during the war years by Chabad, Hakri'a v'Hakdusha, in which he advocated this, in which week after week he wrote messianic poems, articles, kol koreh, announcements addressed to calling on the Jews not to trust in the Allies, because that's mishenet kaneh ratzutz, that's a false support. They will not be saved by the Allies, because the Allies are going to be defeated by Hitler. All this suddenly stopped, and nobody deposed him, nobody abandoned Chabad as a result of it.
Nobody?
The whole messianic, no, I don't think so. Do you know that people did?
Do you know that nobody did?
No, I can't tell you that nobody did. I mean,
I
you may
can
tell me you did.
Very many.
Yeah. It did not put an end to Chabad as a viable movement.
Of course not. Even
Well,
the Karaim exist.
Well, that's my point. That is
Well,
my
everybody exists because Judaism is a pluralistic culture in which everything survives. The Karaim, which is an ancient remnant of the Tzdokim, still survive. The Shomronim still survive.
point. Just.
And the Chabad still survive just.
Oh,
in
more than
spite
just.
in spite of the fact that everything they said is false.
But you are the one who told us
No.
that it's the
Everything
poetic
they
truth
said
that
is
matters.
false. And poetic truth is the matter. It matters for the secular people. It doesn't matter for them. For them, only facts matter. And the fact was that Hitler is a proceeding Messiah, and it was false. And the fact was that the new engineer from France that became a new Messiah is false. And the fact is that they are waiting now for the second coming like Jesus, and it's false. Every single thing they said
But
in
look,
the 20th century is false. And the patronizing tone of saying Scholem as a middle-class German Jew thought that there is no new theology in Hasidism doesn't make a difference, because there is no new theology in Hasidism.
I don't agree with you at all. Can I give you an example?
Since Netanya, nothing happened as far as theology is concerned. But this is really not our concern. The main thing, I think the main problem in your wonderfully enthusiastic, young, as you say, mystical, enthusiastic lecture, the real problem in it is that you didn't propose any criteria for the tremendous success of Hasidism. The fact is that in the end of the 19th century, Hasidism, together with the Misnagdim, were about 90% of the Jewish nation, or 85 or something like that. Today they are less than 5% of the Jewish nation. They are a complete failure. In Israel, 82% of the population says that they are secular. In America, it's more than that. In America, the Jewry has nothing to do with Chabad except for one thing. Kennedy said once that those who say that if there is smoke, it means that there is fire, it's false. If there is smoke, there is a machine that makes smoke. My feeling is you are part of the machine.
All right,
Because to come to us
please
and
be
to say,
quiet.
and to say, in spite of you being secular, I have news for you. Hasidism is an upsurging, developing, growing movement. Where? In Israel, for 50 years, all the religious together, with all the tremendous power that the secular give them. They don't have any power, but we give them power. All the religious together never were more than 20% in the Knesset. Never. They are always a fifth. 72% of the parents are still sending their children to secular schools. Among the 28% that are left, the Haredim, with all their tremendous sources of money that we give them, and you give them, with all this money, they are still not a growing thing. They are growing as far as the children are concerned. Yes, in Jerusalem, 52% of the children go to religious schools. But when they grow up, are they religious? No. A research of Bar Ilan University proved that 25% of every generation that graduates religious schools leave religion. The truth is that all the religious together are a tiny minority. The 20th century is the history of the shrinking of the religious community. Within it, Hasidism kept its ground. It didn't grow very much. Shach is still stronger than all the Hasidim put together. And he's a misnaged, he's a Litvak. And we, the Litvaks, know that the Hasidim, I'm from both
All right.
sides. I mean, I have ancestors that are Litvaks, and I have ancestors that are Gerer, and I have, all my uncles were killed in Auschwitz because they were not allowed to go to Israel, and it was again false, and it again the fault of Hasidism. All this accumulates. Jews are not dumb. Jews understand that if somebody is all the time false, all the time wrong, in the end they abandon him. And that's what happened to Hasidism. We abandoned Hasidism.
Okay, you want to answer? in 2 brief moments.
I was more eager to answer at the beginning than I am at the end, because there's a point at which, of course, I cannot give you statistics. I said statistics are very difficult to come by. Definitions of affiliation are very shaky. People can either exaggerate or understate very easily because definitions are not convincing, ready, set. If you can convince yourself that the phenomenon of Hasidism in the last 20 or 30 years is now shrinking, and that secularization is where this society is heading, then I cannot shake you from this conviction. I don't have the rigorous arsenal of weapons to do that with. I can simply offer you my own conviction on the basis of what I see around me, that it is not so. And we shall see. I can give you evidence of new and interesting developments in Hasidic theology that you confidently say are not there. And I hate to learn from you, and I accept it fully from you, that I sounded patronizing towards Sholem, which I would not like to do at all, and I do not genuinely feel, and I am aware that there's a trend now amongst the revisionists to do that, and I chastise myself for falling into that trap, and I'm grateful to you for pointing it out to me. I don't in any way, I defer to him. Anything that I know is entirely as a result of him doing what he has done, and I feel very humble by the side of him.
Okay, Yehuda?
But
sorry.
the kind of examples I would like to give you of new and interesting developments within Hasidic theology, and let us take Chabad, which so many people find so offensive. Chabad, under Menachem Mendel Schneerson, began in recent years as part of this messianic vision to advocate a teaching to the Gentiles. For the first time in any development within Kabbalistic Judaism, ascribing a positive role to Gentiles in the redeemed world. Gentiles are not going to perish, to cease to exist, because they are the klipot, the evil husks of the Kabbalah, which once you take the divine sparks that sustains them out of them, they just dwindle away and cease to exist. Not at all. There is a role for Gentiles to play. There's a whole body of teachings addressed to and speaking very positively about Gentiles in the post-redemption world in Kabbalistic language, and that is a very original and interesting development. There is similarly, and you see, I am a person who 10 years ago embarked on a study that was designed to show that Hasidism did not teach feminism, and that the popular myths about how the maid of Ludmir, the kind of the young women leaders in Hasidism were, I don't believe, I believe it happened, there were such women, but I believe Hasidism repressed it and disapproved of it entirely, and it ran against the grain. It was happening at grassroots level, and the Hasidic leadership did not tolerate it. At any rate, it does not survive in Hasidic literature. It is a part of popular belletristic descriptions, memories, oral traditions. None of it survives in writings, which means none of it got legitimacy and was not incorporated into any genuine body of Hasidic literature. Nevertheless, within Chabad, in the last 30 years, there is a feminist doctrine. There is a teaching that is deliberately addressed to women, not just, as I thought 10 years ago, mobilizing women very shrewdly as a strategy in the campaign to protect Orthodox practice, halachic Judaism. I did at the time think that that's as far as it goes. And I now know that the previous Rebbe and this Rebbe, the last one, actually began to teach Hasidism to women. Kabbalistic teachings, Hasidic teachings, in a very quiet way in the days of the Admor Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the previous one, and in an increasingly public way under Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And that is an interesting development. You know, if this happened in the 18th century, then any scholar of Hasidism would leap on it with delight and think, how interesting. But because it is something that is happening now and does not fit with this picture of the decline, the decay, the story has come to an end, it has not attracted any attention, and you are not seeing it.
Yaakov.
Yehuda.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yehuda.
I have a question regarding the how you evaluate the recent effort by Eliezer Schweid to examine Hasidic theological thinking, and as you know, he's continuing with his studies on that, and how you view this kind of an attempt at analysis of Hasidic thinking. I'm not going to explain what I'm asking, because I'm sure that you'll do that.
No, do please.
No, Eliezer, no. We know what we are talking about here. A scholar from Hebrew University who deals with Jewish philosophy has tried to examine a series of Hasidic theological works on the Holocaust that were written largely during the Holocaust itself. And he came to a number of rather interesting conclusions regarding that, which are, I think, in line with what you presented. In other words, that there is, on the one hand, a tremendous amount of self-searching and dissatisfaction and despair of the teachings that they inherited, and on the other hand, an attempt to get over it and out of it, including, in one case, the acceptance of the whole Zionist ideology. The two comments that I would make, or three, that Messianism is not limited to Hasidism. That in fact Messianic thinking is common to certainly religious Jewish thought. Some people would argue that this has influenced non-religious Jewish thought as well. And I wonder what you think of the theory that there is something in Jewish culture and civilization that brings it more than in other ethnic or religious ethnic or cultural units to the position that the end of days is now, which, I mean, we know this from Christian eschatology as well, but there it seems to be more the exception, certainly in the last few centuries, whereas in Jewish tradition, certainly in religious Jewish tradition, this has continued. This then becomes a messianic political movement, and therefore tremendously dangerous, of course. And we seem to be falling into the same trap all over again, practically each decade. And peculiarly enough, people don't react to it. In other words, the failure of each messianic attempt like that, although it fails, and they come close one after the other, nevertheless there seems to be no lack of this being continued, of continuation. Your comment about the rise of, or not rise of, secularism in the 20th century, you know, if there hadn't been a realization that irrationalism is rampant, this group would never have organized. So, I think we are very far, at least if I talk for myself, very far from thinking that irrationalism is dead. In fact, that is the reason why we got organized. So, I accept what you say. It's a danger, it's growing, and I think you probably realize, just as much as I do, that this is not a purely Jewish phenomenon, that this is going all around the world, and that the 20th century has in fact these two facets to it. And therefore, you know, the postmodernist label doesn't appeal to me for strictly logical reasons, because modernism includes irrational thinking. And therefore, postmodernism doesn't exist, because postmodernism is simply a continuation of this struggle between, let us say, purely irrational and only partly irrational thinking. So, as far as that is concerned, I would rather agree with you that the Hasidic movement is not declining, that, and that's the problem. In other words, that whether it's growing or not, I can't tell. But declining it is not. And I did some work on the Chabad, and because they seem to me to be, again, as you pointed out, very sophisticated and very modernistic. The very fact that a person who studied ship engineering in France and obviously was not engaged in pure Torah study when he was young, but doing quite different things altogether, and then fell under the spell of this relative of his, who was the really important messianic figure in Chabad, and not
him. Yeah, I agree.
The fact that he sees himself as a Gilgul of his predecessor, and therefore the importance we should ascribe to the predecessor and not to Menachem Mendel, but that this is a Christological movement, not the first one, but certainly a very typically modernistic one, where it is quite obvious that there's not going to be another Lubavitcher Rebbe, because there can't be one. So, to me at least, this is obvious. I think that this creates a tremendous danger within, which can be only combated by understanding. And by understanding, I mean to go into the recesses of these minds and see where this comes from, and then provide some kind of answer. But that's no longer a scholarly exercise. That is something quite different.
Well, I can only agree with everything that you've said, and I take your points and I appreciate them very much. I think we don't have any argument at all.
But what about Elie
The only
Schweid?
thing, the what? Elie Schweid. No, I mean, I regret, quite genuinely, as I was talking, and by that time I had abandoned my text, and that I remembered Mendel Piekarz's studies of Hasidic literature in the face of the Holocaust, and I did not mention Elie Schweid's, which I think are extremely interesting, and I agree with your evaluation of them, and I think that he is detecting developments within Hasidic literature that have not generally been acknowledged. I find I have not myself covered the same track. I am protesting that we have not looked enough at 20th century Hasidism. I have myself studied only a very small portion of it, and that is again Chabad, and to a certain extent Braslav in the 20th century. And neither of them is involved. Chabad have an interesting an interesting alternative focus. Their catastrophe is Stalin. And that is at least what I have tried to cover. For them, it is communist oppression that has been the focus. And they have tried to deflate attention for a long time from the Holocaust itself, with which they're only just recently beginning to come to grips. And I'm not myself sufficiently at home with this literature to be able to say more than just that I find what Elie Schweid has done very interesting. The only other thing I wanted to say is what are we gaining by labeling this postmodern as opposed to modern? And I myself am very uncomfortable with a postmodernist label. I am always apologetic when I even utter the word, and nevertheless I'm increasingly finding it useful in certain situations. The kind of picture that I see in which the upsurge of this kind of irrationality that you rightly say never disappeared and is the reason why you're all here. But nevertheless, there's a difference between looking at it from the perspective of the majority on a small enclave of some remnant of the past to looking at it from the perspective of perhaps what is increasingly becoming an enclave of some surviving kind of anti-irrationality spirit in a world in which all around irrationality is becoming more and more acceptable, more and more the norm, and I'm speaking in the widest possible sense, not just within the Western, but worldwide in developing countries all around us. So the context in which I see it, the critique of the institutions of Hasidism that are hereditary, that are archaic, one can see it in the context in which, in which democracy is in crisis all over the world. The principles of democracy are not necessarily the principles that are going to